Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you before we jump into today's episode. What are you grateful for? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. There was a time not too long ago when I tried to get into journaling, creating a daily habit of sitting down with my thoughts and writing out things like what I hoped to do that day and what I was thankful for and what I was grateful for. And to be honest, it never stuck with me. I couldn't keep the practice growing and going because it felt inauthentic to me. It felt performative. It felt weird to sit down and have to think of something that day that I was grateful for. And I know, as weird as this may sound, there were days when it was a real struggle, where things weren't going great, and the act of trying to be grateful seemed not healthy, not helpful. Now, admittedly, I've always kind of had this weird relationship with the practice of gratitude. For whatever reason, I don't know, I just don't connect with it. For a lot of other people, they do, and that's great, and I champion you and I urge you on. It's just not me. But when I came across the work of my guests today, Belinda and Omar Brownson, I'm not going to say my view on gratitude changed, but the practice of it and what it could be, I was inspired in a lot of ways. Because, as you'll hear in this conversation with Belinda and Omar, who are part of an organization called Gratitude Blooming, Belinda is the co-founder, and Omar hosts the Gratitude Blooming podcast. What you'll hear in this conversation is that gratitude doesn't have to always be about you. It can be more of a focus on the world around you, and that this idea of gratitude fatigue, that we have to force gratitude in places and in times when it doesn't feel like the thing that we want to do in that moment. How do we keep it fresh? How do we focus ourselves and our gratefulness elsewhere and have it still be something that can be a positive thing, both for us and the world around us? And for Belinda and Omar, it starts by looking to nature. Belinda and Omar have courses and workshops, but they also have this deck of cards that you pull a card out each day and it gives you a flower and a reflection inspired by nature, beautiful artwork with stuff that isn't always super positive. It may be reflecting on sorrow or doubt that you've had in your past. I love thinking of gratitude as a way of going inward, creating more introspection and self-awareness and self-reflection of yourself rather than always having to force positivity, like I said, in places that perhaps in that moment, positivity doesn't belong. This is a really great conversation with Belinda and Omar because we talk about the concept of the third object, in this case, perhaps something in nature, as a way to indirectly connect with people around us, to bring about a little bit more gratefulness in our lives, and to figure out how we work well together and collaborate and find solutions for gratitude, for happiness, for positivity that don't seem forced and that are free of judgment. The most pressing question on my mind right now, honestly, as we just get this going, is why flowers? Why flowers in nature? Belinda, I got to ask you, like, where did that come from?
Well, nature is a universal point of life. It's no one can say I've never experienced nature. I don't know what flowers are. There's very few things in the world that are that universal, I feel. And it's interesting because our co-founder, Arlene Kinsuda, the artist, she was the one that inspired me to think about flowers in a different way, because she sketched 100 plants for 100 days. And in that process of looking at a plant each day, literally a word emerged from that connection. And when I saw the words, it was, words like joy and presence, beautiful sadness, inexhaustible abundance coming from the plant that she was sketching. I was like, wow, there's something there that can teach us about life and how we navigate the joy as well as the struggles. And flowers are constantly teaching us that, plants in the cycles of the seasons. And, if we can find gratitude in the good and the hard things, like, isn't that ultimately like the journey of the school of life that we're on?
Was there something going on that resonated so deeply with you? Was there something going on with you?
Well, yeah. I mean, one is I've always gone to nature for my own healing and my own, when I get stuck in my mind or stuck in the chaos of like go, go, go life, I go to nature to find inner peace. And at the time, I was really wanting to find something, a simple practice that could really be accessible and universal for all people. In some ways, it's the most simplest form of spirituality. I feel every religion kind of has this connection back to nature. And for me, I was looking for the right medium to have that entry point into these practices. And when I saw the art and the nature together, it was like something clicked. And so it's like, I think it comes from the seeking of this, desire to grow and evolve and also find ways to kind of ease some of the inner suffering that I personally have felt in my life, just from being stressed, being overwhelmed, going too fast.
And Omar, how about you? I know you've done work in sustainability and other areas, but what about it resonated with you that you would come on board a project like this?
They worked, would be the short answer. I've had my own personal gratitude, mindfulness practices for probably the last 7 years, launched my own gratitude app, G Thanks. And then through the pandemic was holding weekly Zoom series called Thankful Thursday, where I invited different mindfulness, wellness teachers. And so it gave me a chance to sort of see a lot of different practices and a lot of different ways in which people can become more present and sort of aware of their emotions and their feelings and how to kind of connect to the moment in a different way. And we were just starting to see that these gratitude circles that we started to hold with the cards shifted people's energy in a unique way. The science behind it is it's called a third object. So it gives you a little distance to sort of look at your emotions in a different way. And I think there's something, it is kind of amazing sort of across gender and, geography. Almost everyone has some memory of a flower, whether it's in their own backyard, at a grandma's, or just on a walk in their neighborhood. Somebody always like, oh, I love the gardenia and how it smells. And it reminds me of every summer when I went to go visit so-and-so. And so that ability to kind of evoke memories, oftentimes in a very positive way, really was like, okay, there's something to this. I'm not going to overthink it, and let's just keep going.
Omar, you mentioned right there the concept or the idea of the third object. Can you explain that a little bit more?
So the way that I like to simplify it, and this occurred to me the other day, I was on one of my daily walks, and there is this person walking their dog, and it was like this cute, I don't know if it was like a husky, and it was those piercing eyes that huskies have. And I was like, oh my God, it was a beautiful dog. And I was looking at the dog when I said it, and I just kept going, right? And it sort of occurred to me, I was like, this is really strange. Like, I didn't acknowledge the human being at all walking the dog. I only sort of acknowledged the dog. Well, the dog in some ways is a third object. It gives us a way to sort of start engagement that's a little bit safer, right? Like talking to someone, even if it's something as innocent as like, your dog is beautiful, is a little bit more of a direct kind of communication. And the thing about emotions is that emotions are sort of very indirect, right? We don't always necessarily know where they're coming from. And so to me, I think about the cards as like walking your dog. It's like your dog of emotions. And like, let me sort of project my feelings onto that. And then I can kind of get to sort of a certain safe place to then sort of deal more directly with the people in my life.
So, Belinda, how does a recognition of the ways that we are tied into nature grow or plant the seeds, I should say, of a gratitude practice? How did that come about for you?
Well, it's interesting because I think Omar and I started from the same place, just thinking of things that we felt grateful for. And it started to become a practice where I noticed I was just like saying the same thing over and over again, and maybe a little autopilot-y. And even though, I felt that how it could shift my mindset, it started to feel less and less engaging. And in my mind, I was like, well, what are the different ways that I could be provoked to think about the things that I'm grateful for in different ways? And at the time, I had been doing a lot of work with groups. My background is in urban education. I've worked a lot with teachers and principals and district leaders. And a lot of that work was around cultural change and how do we manage, how do we work well together? How do we trust each other? How do we collaborate, but first from a place of knowing each other and being able to share honest feedback. And so there was something in the back of my mind that was always looking for a practice that could also be a shared practice that could have a ripple effect of a culture, of a team, of a community. And so when I saw Arlene's art and we got this idea, well, why don't we create this physical thing that can remind people, bring people back to their own humanity in some ways through nature? Could it be a practice that could be personal as well as collective? And so we just tried it for ourselves, just picking a card randomly and we created 39 prompts to go with each of them. And I was always surprised at how the randomness always kind of like was so spot on. On a day when I really needed to practice trust, the wildflower would show up and ask me about, are you really trusting in the situation? Or on a day when I was feeling really scattered, the joy and presence card would show up with the hummingbird and the Indian paintbrush. And so it was just through this kind of moments of delight and just, nature kind of being the guide in some ways. Like sometimes you can resist people, but like a plant is just, it's almost like a part of us in some ways where you can't help but listen to that message. And then what happened basically was I felt like there was a lot of personal power. And then we just started to experiment with family members and, being from a Taiwanese background and being an immigrant from Taiwan, it's hard to talk about emotions with your family. And I come from a culture where you don't talk about emotions. You pretend everything is fine. There's a little passive aggressiveness that comes out, but then that's just how you handle it as a family. And I remember the day that I started to just, introduce it to my mom and dad. And it got my dad to even share something personal that he wouldn't have otherwise done. And from there, just started to explore different ways of, working with different communities, trying it in, healthcare and education. And Omar basically came in at such a beautiful time where it was like, we're two entrepreneurs passionate about gratitude, looking for a way to make a big impact. And really, I give a lot of credit to Omar for putting words to the sense that I had that this could really work. He really helped to codify this practice and this process so that now we've literally in the past 2 years hosted hundreds of these circles online and have seen the impact just consistently in every single one of them, which is remarkable.
I definitely want to get into the impact of those circles, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into something you brought up there, Belinda. The sometimes, and forgive me the language I'm about to use, but the sometimes trite nature of gratitude practices, the almost cliche-ness of it. How do we avoid that to where it feels like you're being authentically grateful?
Omar, I think you should take that question because I feel like you talk really well about this.
Well, it's fun listening to hear Belinda's origin stories around it, and how do you not get into that rut of list 3 things that you're grateful for today, and which is, I think, how most people talk about a gratitude practice. And there's a thing actually called gratitude fatigue, which is when you start saying thankful or you're saying thanks for the same thing over and over again, it actually does create a little bit of a fatigue to it. And so, how do you keep it fresh, which is the whole point. And I think this is where the gratitude blooming cards and the use of nature is that nature reminds us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, right? And this is, again, kind of what I love about gratitude as a social emotion, is that it's inherently not about you, right? It's actually about how do you relate to the world around you. And so then what is that experience that you can create that keeps it fresh? And this is sort of speaking of kind of trite sayings, but it's one of my favorites, and I haven't found a better way to say it, which is the only difference between wellness and illness is we versus I. And I think what ends up happening is that left to our own devices, we do get in ruts. We do fall into sort of, I don't want to call them bad habits, but habits, right? And when we fall back into a habit, we go into sort of a default mindset, and then we're no longer present. And we can do that with anything. You can do that meditating. You can do that running. You can do that with any kind of intentional exercise, which is to fall back to your sort of default mindset. And so the whole point, which is how do I disrupt habit, right? That's what practice is meant to do. And so I think using nature, and now I can go on a walk in my neighborhood, and I don't necessarily need to use the cards. I use them, but I don't need to. Now I can just be like today on my walk, I was like, oh, look at this plant is now growing. I never noticed all these plants growing around me. I would just sort of, seasons could pass and I'm like, oh, that tree's no longer there. I wonder what happened. Now I'm a little bit more conscientious of okay, seasons are changing, plants are changing. And I think that's what nature reminds us, is that change is constant. And what we know is not constant is our ability to adapt to change. And so part of what these practices are really helping us to do is accelerate the pace of change that we can sort of manage. And if we're not sort of staying present to the changes, then we're back to that sort of default mindset.
What happens then in the moments where gratitude feels untrue?
So this is, both Belinda and I think, have a similar approach to gratitude. So the beginning practice of any gratitude is just making good visible, right? And that's what, hey, 3 things that I'm grateful for, is just really a practice around making visible what you value. I like to call this second approach fearless gratitude, which is how do I actually make visible things that I take for granted or conscientiously make invisible, like the full range of emotions that I have. And this was sort of my own journey, which is, I wanted to be less impatient, right? Because that was my Achilles heel. And I suffer. And then, and I had a monk tell me, he's like, that's the root word, right? Impatience means to suffer. And so I was trying to figure out, like, well, how do I care about getting things done in the world and be non-attached at the same time? And my misunderstanding of non-attachment was I thought non-attachment meant not feeling, right? Like, I'm going to have my headspace. I am going to be calm, and I am not going to let my emotions mess with me. That's just ego and willpower. That's actually not mindfulness. And so what I've learned over time is that I can feel my emotions without becoming my emotions. And then to really answer your question, I like to think about gratitude as a way for us to learn to trigger our positive emotions so that we don't become triggered by our negative ones. It's not that we don't feel our negative emotions or the charged emotions. It's that we become sort of more aware of, like, oh, there's impatience. Impatience is going to get me to anger. I don't want to go there. And so how do I, like, become aware of that emotion, feel it, don't try to suppress it, because that'll actually make it sort of pressurize and sort of build up more. But how do I sort of let it go? I took my daughter today to the dermatologist, and as we were waiting to go in, she read me a poem that she's working on, and it was called Confession Room. And so she was talking about this room where you have your confessions, and she then said she was a waiting room, and waiting rooms allow you a little space away from what you need to confess. And so I think if I can conclude this sort of analogy, I feel like gratitude creates a waiting room for our emotions, so that we don't actually have to sort of like experience them so immediately, and give them a moment to sort of rest and pause before we decide which way do we want to go with them.
And it's so fun to be able to, go back to the basics with you, Michael, because it's been a while since Omar and I've even talked about these questions. And I think as I'm sitting with it, I have new ways that I'm seeing it now in this moment. And I think the evolution of this practice, I would say it's like this way of being with something. And you don't necessarily have to say, I'm grateful for that thing, for it to be an expression of this energy of gratitude. So I feel like one of the things I'm really grateful for with these cards is, I'll pick a card, and, sorrow, I think, is the one that's like hits people at the heart. Like, oh, like you don't want to get that card. But when you look at the plant, the touch me not, and you look at the word and you sit with the question, it's not trying to force you to be like, okay, now I'm grateful for the sorrow. It's just like, can you take a moment to acknowledge the courage behind any sorrow that you feel for loving so much? And so it's just being with it, and in some ways embodying what is the spirit of this plant. And I think Omar and I've been playing with words and trying to express, what is this thing? And I think gratitude is the closest thing. And I feel like there might be another thing that we, invent around it.
And I mean, talking about the sorrow card, we were holding a gratitude circle for ICU nurses in a pediatric unit. And this was our first gratitude circle with them. And we pulled the sorrow card. And I was like, oh, gosh, we pulled sorrow immediately. And it ended up, they had just lost a child that they had kept alive for like 280 days. And they actually hadn't been given any space to name the sorrow that they felt, right? Like they had been so busy in the hospital, and then, with the pandemic, and there's really no downtime for them to then process these things at home or anywhere else. And so they were actually incredibly grateful to be given the space to just acknowledge the sorrow that they were feeling. It was a real feeling they were having that they couldn't actually name anywhere else in their lives. And so this is, to me, where gratitude and why fearless gratitude, which is like, how do we make visible everything that exists, whether we like it or not, right? It's there, right? We can't wish some of these things away. And so the fearlessness is the willingness to actually engage it, that you're alive, that you're feeling these emotions and as strong as you are. And there's something about just being able to bear witness, to not judge, to not say this is right or wrong, right? I think that's where maybe gratitude, kind of is confusing, is that we want to make it right or wrong versus just it's there and we're just being given a chance to notice it and to acknowledge it. And that's often so much what people want. So often people feel invisible. This is the way we get into fights and arguments, is people feel unheard, and so the graciousness of being able to just acknowledge what is, not to say I agree or disagree, it just is there. It gives a little bit more room for compassion and empathy, which I think we've seen are so important for the times that we're in. But honestly, just being human, I think these things are important for us to be able to cultivate.
Belinda, correct me if I'm wrong. The cards have questions on them, correct?
So they have a booklet of questions that come with it. So we intentionally do not put the question on the card,
okay,
because we want people to really activate their own inner knowing and make meaning for themselves before they look at the book.
And the book filled with questions. Why ask questions rather than have people just recite statements?
It's a great question. Go ahead.
Because there can be so many different answers. And one statement is almost saying there's only one way. And we've discovered so many different pathways, just people looking at the plant. Sometimes it's the number of the card number. I know Omar's number 33 is a big one. And the theme, like beautiful sadness, sorrow, joy, and presence. And the prompt is almost kind of at the end. It's like, okay, see if this resonates or not. And, we started the gratitude circles really focusing a lot on the prompts. And then over time, and Omar, really experimenting with a lot of different kinds of communities, like you kind of started to bring it back to, let's focus on the plant and the theme first to see what emerges. You want to talk a little bit about that process?
Well, when we hold a gratitude circle, we name 3 intentions. So the first intention is that you are your best inner teacher. So therefore, number 2, there's no need to fix, save, or advise anyone else. And then lastly, silence is a participant, which makes room for discomfort and discovery. Affirmations, in many ways, are like an answer. And we really think that the answer is already within you. You just need a little bit of space to actually discover it for yourself. And that's where the greatest lessons are learned, are the ones that we learn on our own, right? Not because someone told us what the answer was. It's like we actually had to verify it. There's a Yasaro tribal saying that I love, which is knowledge is just a rumor until it's felt in the bones. And a question really gives us space to actually feel what is in our bones and to come up with the answer that speaks most truly to us.
Oh, goodness. You just gave me some goosebumps there, Omar. Literally, my wife and I were sitting on the couch right outside that door right there last night talking about gratitude and how unhelpful it can be sometimes to try and push gratitude onto people when they don't feel it. And something you just mentioned there, Omar, really struck. You said you're not trying to fix anyone. You are simply there to affirm and lift up, I believe you said. How do we show up for others who are not? Is this what the circles are for? Is showing up for others who may not feel that awareness of what's going on in their life?
I think where we've gone in our experience is really around embodiment. So I don't know how much sort of study you've done around embodiment work, but it's almost like, how do you actually physically embody or feel into mindfulness or meditation or gratitude? And one of the most powerful things around embodiment work is, how grounded are you? Do you want to change how someone else feels? Then be more grounded. If you're not grounded and you're kind of coming into a conversation sort of frenetic, that's what you're going to be bringing to the table. And so part of again, just not trying to like tell someone to be grateful. If you're just truly grateful for being with someone, they're going to feel that. You're not going to actually need to say anything, right? Like, and it's just that presence. This was, again, a lot of my lessons learned have been through parenting. And I remember when my kids, particularly when they were younger, how exhausting it was to put them to bed, right? They'd have a million excuses. Oh, can you get me something to drink? I need to go to the bathroom. Like, there was always like one more thing that they needed, right? And I'm tired at the end of the day, and this was back to my impatience, and I would escalate, and then, I'd be yelling soon enough. And at some point I was like, this is clearly not working, right? And so I would go in knowing, I'm like, okay, they're going to test me because this is what they do. But I don't actually have to react. I can just be like, no, you're not going to get anything to drink. No, you should go to the bathroom before you go to bed. And then all of a sudden, they could see that they were getting no reaction out of me. And they were like, okay, well, we're going to bed now, right? And this is where that waiting room of emotions, right? Like, where is that space that allows the sort of emotion to sit for a second before you actually have to? So all of a sudden you're responding to emotions as opposed to reacting to emotions, right? Reacting is sort of like the world coming at us and then we are reacting. Response is like, what is happening to me and how am I bringing that into the world?
And oftentimes I find that our circles are really just like what you would imagine when you look at a circle and, people sitting around, and it's this holding of the space collectively. And, the circle represents the and wholeness just as a shape. And, we each are bringing a gift of our presence into that space. And we're also able to receive something. And it could be different for different people. And that was something I was, initially concerned about, is, do we need to have to control or manage the expectations around these things? And what we have found is clarity around the intent of the circle and the space that we're holding has actually been the most important thing. And then leaving room for a lot of synchronicity, a lot of randomness through these cards so people can be surprised. And when you're in that space of like, I don't know what to expect, you're really open. And therefore, the person that might be doubting is curious. And the person that's like always been a, diehard gratitude person then just has another entry point into that. And so it literally creates all these different pathways for people to express and to participate.
Belinda, go ahead. Go ahead, Omar.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things we talked about at the beginning was around trust. And I think learning that the change we want to see in the world only kind of proceeds at the pace of our own inner transformation. And I think trust is one of those things where it's like gratitude. It begins first by giving it, not by taking it, right? Like, trust begets trust. Gratitude begins with the giving, not the receiving, not the taking. And so that sort of willingness to trust the space and trust the unknown. This is, I think, what is so essential is so many people want to know what the end is, and they kind of then work backwards. And the challenge with that is knowing what the end is puts us into sort of our logic, if then kind of mindset. And again, the challenge with emotions is they're not logical, right? And so how do we actually create space for the unknown to unfold that's not threatening, right? Like, how do we sort of ease into change? Really means we need to create a little bit of space for trust that we don't necessarily know all the answers, but we know some of the questions.
Belinda, in adopting Omar's daughter's idea of the waiting room, am I would I be correct in saying that gratitude in and of itself is not the goal? That is actually to be more aware of how you show up in the world and how the world shows up to you? Am I on the right track there?
I think Omar and I, like each separately and together, wanted to create an entryway that a door that everyone could open. And gratitude is that easy door to open. But ultimately, in the work of Gratitude Blooming, what we're here for is how can we deepen our relationship to ourselves in our own awareness of our emotions and, how we're navigating the unknown, the things that show up in our lives day to day, moment to moment. How do we then relate to other people, and how can we cultivate a different way of seeing and noticing and feeling and sensing with other people? And then I think it goes back to the question that you started with, is like, why plants and flowers is ultimately to create a different kind of relationship with the planet. And, I've been working on, how do we talk about this ultimate mission too? Because, we're kind of in a tricky place with humanity and the planet right now. We don't know how long we have on Earth before climate change, really affects our survival. And so can we, besides just eating healthy and recycling and composting, also start to look at the plants around us in a way where it's like a friend or a loved one, really relating to it, like what Omar described of walking his, neighborhood and starting to notice things about the trees. And for me, that I can't help but wonder if we could hold that kind of reverence and have that kind of relationship with nature. Like, how would that change the way that we interact with the things that like the earth gives us? And sometimes we make those things they're made invisible to us because we take it so much for granted. I mean, I definitely do. And this practice has really shifted just how I look at things. And it is such a gift to like have these plants grow and to be able to eat them or the beauty that they create. And I have for many years taken that for granted, that relationship.
A question for both of you is, and that your answer there, Belinda, flows perfectly into this. What is the impact of this? What can we point to and say, this is how this shows up in the world?
Well, I think we've been trying to experiment with that in different ways. So at the most granular level is my relationship to my wife, my daughters, my family, and we practice gratitude every night as a family and being able to acknowledge those emotions. I, like Belinda, on my mother's side is family. I'm 5th generation Chinese American, so we've been here a long time, but some of those cultural sort of ideas of how you acknowledge emotions didn't exist, right? And so that's sort of the most immediate kind of circle of influence. Then the second is us holding gratitude circles for folks in philanthropy, business, healthcare. And so if a boss, is able to be a little bit more gracious about how they're listening, or the healthcare workers and the nurses and the suffering they've been through on the front lines are able to give themselves a little bit more self-compassion and healing, how are they going to show up for the next patient a little bit better, for their own families? We've heard directly, like they've got kids and as well. And how are they parenting, and what is happening to their families? I think ultimately, though, I spent my career building things, like literally, at the scale of regional Los Angeles River and 51 miles, and trying to think about green infrastructure. And at the end of the day, I realized that the change that I think is needed in the world isn't going to happen through just bricks and sticks. It's going to happen through hearts and culture change. And what is culture? Culture is just a series of habits. It's a series of things that we do every day And so it's like in our sayings, practice what we preach. And so what are those practices that really will change our relationship to each other and our planet so that we can be here, I hope, for the long haul?
Belinda, how about you?
Well, it's so funny, the two podcast episodes I listened for you. I mean, so relevant. You talk about the dangers of self-care and how, when we go deeply inward, we can self-alienate. And what I hope for is that we can create a new language for how we relate to ourselves, and then be able to speak it out to our loved ones, because so many of us are lonely and we're suffering. And especially during this time, it's just getting amplified. The amount of mental health issues that we have collectively is tremendous. And so, what Omar and I hope for is just, can we offer something really simple that can resonate with a lot of people? And nature is inherently healing. Looking at something beautiful, or something that reminds us of, impermanence. It's all beautiful. It's all important for us to acknowledge. And so we're just giving people, in some ways, like a framework, a way of seeing all the different perspectives on life. And then hopefully, if a loved one is practicing it, or a team member is also practicing it, then you could say, I'm having one of those days where courage is really important, or wow, I'm really feeling the beautiful sadness today. And it's kind of like, you don't have to explain anymore, right? Then you've got this new language to talk about stuff. And then suddenly you feel less lonely. And then you look out the window and you see nature in a different way, and you want to take care of it because it's precious.
Gosh, I love both of those answers so stinking much. I love it. Well, Belinda, you know what's coming up next because you listened to a couple of episodes. Omar, I'm not sure if you know, but I ask all of my guests, what is the question that you wish you were asked more? And so, Belinda, I'd love to start with you. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
Gosh, I want to go really silly with that, but I'm not going to.
You can take that whatever direction you want to go.
Oh man, it's hard.
Go with silly.
Well, now I don't feel silly. It just passed. Omar, if you have it first, there's a couple things running through, and I don't want to rush the answer. Do you have something right away, Omar?
I don't have a pithy one. I think the question that's been on my mind a lot is, what is our relationship to time? I think we often spend time thinking about time is money, and time is not money. Time is sitting in the waiting room with my daughter and having her tell me a poem about being in a waiting room. And it's those little moments. And I remember, again, just early on when my kids were young, it was, the days are long, but the years are short. And so how to really appreciate the little things, because those become the big things ultimately.
Belinda, anything come to mind?
Okay, I'm really taking this like very seriously. So I was trying to think about a question that's been asked of me that I wish more people would ask, like you're saying. And a friend not too long ago asked me, imagine yourself as like an 85-year-old. Who do you want her to be? What do you want her to be like? I spend a lot of time looking backwards and trying to be present. And I don't spend a lot of time imagining myself as an elder. And, I said to him, I was like, I want her to feel joyful. I want her to feel wise. And I want her to feel like she's having a great time. And so sometimes when I'm having like a bad day, I'll just try to remember that question, because it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, like, where do you want to be at that point, after all of the journeys of life? And so I just love that question.
I hadn't thought of that, but that is a beautiful question as well. My goodness. Omar, Belinda, thank you so very much for not only the work that you do, but coming on here and sharing it with me and with this audience. How can people connect with Gratitude Blooming? I know you have a podcast. Just please tell us how we can connect with both of you.
Well, I think the most obvious one is our website. It's gratitudeblooming.com. We're also on Instagram and Facebook, and we also have a new Discord channel. Omar is stewarding our space holding in the Web3 world. So I'll share a little bit about that.
Yeah, for 2022, it's how do we really be present with people in lots of different ways. And we're moving from just the physical card deck to the digital version that we've held to, looking at creating some NFTs and other ways in which we can share gratitude in the multiverse.
Beautiful stuff. Wonderful. Omar, Belinda, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. I appreciate it. Best of luck and best wishes to you and those you love. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Oh my gosh, so many thanks to Belinda and Omar for sharing their time and their story with me on the show this week. Please do me and Belinda and Omar a huge favor. Share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to our conversation all about gratitude. Share this episode with your network on Twitter, on LinkedIn, wherever you have a network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the incredible guests that I have on the show, like Belinda and Omar, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.